The attack on Foolio's family. While Yungin Ace and his crew were dealing with the loss of their loved ones, Foolio was also facing attacks on his own family. Just like Ace, Foolio's family became targets in the ongoing war. In one particularly terrifying incident, Foolio's mother's house was shot at while she was inside. The bullets ripped through the walls, barely missing her as she slept. This wasn't the first time Foolio's family had been caught in the crossfire. His mother had been shot at multiple times before, and it seemed like there was no escape from the violence for any of the families involved in the gang wars. Foolio blamed himself for the attacks on his family, knowing that his involvement in the gang wars had put them in danger. But even though he felt responsible, he wasn't about to back down. Foolio was determined to keep fighting, no matter the cost. Boss Goon and more losses. Another tragic figure in this story is Boss Goon, a member of Foolio's crew who also suffered a great loss. After being released from jail, Boss Goon tried to get his life back on track. He started performing at clubs and trying to make a name for himself in the music industry. But the gang wars in Jacksonville had a way of catching up with people, no matter how hard they tried to escape. One night, after performing at a club in Jacksonville, Boss Goon and his family were ambushed as they drove home. Another car pulled up beside them and opened fire, shooting over 100 bullets into their vehicle. Boss Goon was killed instantly, and his family was left devastated. Despite the tragedy, Boss Goon's father promised not to seek revenge, hoping that the violence would finally come to an end. But in Jacksonville, promises of peace are hard to keep. The cycle of revenge had already been set in motion, and no matter how much Boss Goon's father wanted to avoid more bloodshed, the violence continued. More families were torn apart by the gang wars, and the streets of Jacksonville remained dangerous for anyone involved in the conflict. The arrests begin. As the violence in Jacksonville raged on, the police were working hard to track down the people responsible for the murders and attacks. It wasn't an easy job, especially with so many gang members involved and witnesses often too scared to come forward. But slowly, the authorities began to piece together the evidence they needed to make arrests. One of the key moments in the investigation came when the police pulled over a car driven by a young man named Sean Gathright. During the traffic stop, the police found marijuana in the car, but that was just the beginning. They also discovered a semi-automatic pistol and several rounds of rifle ammunition in the vehicle. This discovery linked Gathright to multiple shootings in Jacksonville, including the murder of Foolio. Investigators quickly realized that Gathright wasn't working alone. They found surveillance footage from his home that showed him loading bags into a car with another suspect, Isaiah Chance. This led the police to Chance's home, where they arrested him and his girlfriend, Alicia Andrews. The arrests marked a major breakthrough in the case, but there were still more suspects on the loose. Rashads and Davin Murphy knew that their time was running out. After their associates were arrested, the Murphy brothers went into hiding, trying to avoid the same fate. But the police were determined to bring them in, and the hunt for the remaining suspects continued. The war in Jacksonville was far from over, and the Murphy brothers were still on the run. The violence and retaliation kept escalating, and more families were drawn into the deadly conflict. As the police closed in on the suspects, the story of Foolio, his killers, and their families would only get more complicated and tragic. The hunt for the Murphy brothers. After the arrests of several key figures connected to Foolio's murder, the focus turned to the Murphy brothers, Rashads and Davin. The police knew they were involved, but tracking them down was proving to be a challenge. Jacksonville had become a city on edge, with gang violence escalating and the authorities working tirelessly to put an end to the bloodshed. For Rashads and Davin, hiding was their only option, but they couldn't stay hidden. Rashads Murphy's standoff. Rashads Murphy, the older of the two brothers, had been laying low, trying to avoid getting caught. But after weeks of evading the law, his time was running out. The police, along with U.S. Marshals, had been tracking him, and they finally caught up with him at an apartment complex on Collins Road in Jacksonville. When law enforcement arrived, they found that Rashads had barricaded himself inside the apartment. The situation quickly turned into a standoff. The police surrounded the building and began evacuating nearby residents to ensure their safety. Meanwhile, they attempted to negotiate with Rashads, hoping to convince him to surrender peacefully. For hours, Rashads refused to come out, even going so far as to point a gun to his head while on a FaceTime call with his girlfriend. The tension was high, and it seemed like the standoff could end in tragedy at any moment. As the hours dragged on, the police continued their attempts to get Rashad to surrender. But despite their efforts, he remained holed up inside the apartment, refusing to give himself up. After nearly 12 hours of negotiation, the situation reached a breaking point. The SWAT team was called in to breach the apartment and bring the standoff to an end. Finally, seeing that he had no other options, Rashad Murphy surrendered to the authorities. He was taken into custody without further incident, bringing an end to the standoff that had kept the city on edge for half a day. But while Rashad was now behind bars, his cousin Davin was still on the run, and the police knew that the job wasn't done yet. Davin Murphy, the fugitive. Unlike his cousin, Davin Murphy had managed to stay hidden after the arrests began. The police were actively searching for him, but he was proving to be a difficult target to track down. With Rashad now in custody, Davin was one of the last remaining suspects connected to Foolio's murder who was still at large. The authorities were determined to find him, but he had managed to keep a low profile. For Davin, life on the run wasn't easy. He had to constantly look over his shoulder, knowing that the police could catch up with him at any moment. But Davin wasn't just trying to avoid getting arrested. He was also dealing with the pressure of being one of the last key figures in the gang war still standing. The tension in Jacksonville was at an all-time high, and Davin's capture could either escalate the violence further or bring some sense of closure to the families involved. The police were urging the public to come forward with any information about Davin's whereabouts, hoping that someone might help lead them to the fugitive. They knew that as long as Davin was on the loose, the violence in Jacksonville could continue to spiral out of control. But despite their efforts, Davin remained elusive, and the city waited anxiously for the next development in the case. Foolio's final moments. While the Murphy brothers were trying to stay one step ahead of the law, investigators were piecing together the details of Foolio's murder. The evidence showed that Foolio's death had been the result of a well-planned operation by his rivals. On the night of his murder, Foolio had been in Tampa, celebrating his birthday, and thought he had escaped the reach of his enemies. But they were closer than he realized. Isaiah Chance and his girlfriend Alicia Andrews had been tracking Foolio all night, following him from Jacksonville to Tampa. They had even visited multiple locations where Foolio had stopped, dropping his location to the rest of the crew that was planning the attack. It was a carefully coordinated operation, and Foolio had no idea that death was just around the corner. After being kicked out of an Airbnb due to the size of his party, Foolio shifted the celebration to a nightclub called Truth 18 Lounge. But even there, his enemies were tracking his every move. After leaving the club, Foolio headed to a Holiday Inn in Tampa, planning to retire for the night. Little did he know that his killers were already waiting for him. At around 4:40 a.m., Tampa police received a call about a shootout in the parking lot of the Holiday Inn. When they arrived, they found 2 cars that had been shot up, with 4 people affected by the attack. Foolio was dead, having been killed just hours after celebrating his birthday. 3 others were injured, but they survived the attack. Foolio's death sent shockwaves through Jacksonville, marking yet another tragic chapter in the ongoing war between the gangs. Youngin Ace's response. As news of Foolio's murder spread, Youngin Ace wasted no time celebrating his rival's death. In the world of Jacksonville's gang wars, there was no room for sympathy or mourning. Instead, Youngin Ace took to music to express his feelings about Foolio's demise. He released 2 diss tracks, Do It and Game Over, in which he taunted Foolio and his crew, making it clear that he saw Foolio's death as a victory. In Game Over, Youngin Ace didn't hold back, dropping lines that made it clear he was reveling in Foolio's death. The song even included references to the way Foolio died, with Ace mocking his rival and calling the situation Game Over. The song's title and timing were particularly disrespectful, as they were released just days after Foolio's death. For Youngin Ace, this was more than just a rap beef. It was personal, and he wanted the world to know that he had won. Ace's actions didn't go unnoticed. His diss tracks quickly spread across social media, further fueling the tension between the rival gangs. The violence in Jacksonville was far from over, and Foolio's death was just another step in the long and bloody war that had consumed the city. The end of the road for Davin Murphy. After months of hiding, Davin Murphy's luck finally ran out. The police, acting on a tip from an anonymous source, tracked him to a small house on the outskirts of Jacksonville. Davin had been staying with a friend, hoping to keep a low profile until the heat died down. But the police had been relentless in their search, and now they had him cornered. When the police arrived at the house, Davin tried to flee, but he was quickly surrounded. With no way out, he surrendered to the authorities, ending his time on the run. The capture of Davin Murphy marked a significant victory for the police, who had been working tirelessly to bring him in. But for the people of Jacksonville, the capture of one man didn't mean the end of the violence. Davin's arrest brought some relief to the families who had been living in fear, but it also raised questions about what would happen next. Would the violence finally stop now that the key players in Foolio's murder were either dead or behind bars? Or would the war continue, with new leaders stepping up to take their place? The aftermath. In the months following Davin Murphy's arrest, Jacksonville remained tense. The city had seen too much violence, and it would take time for the wounds to heal. The arrest of Davin and the death of Foolio had removed some of the main instigators of the violence, but the hatred and anger between the gangs still lingered. The police increased their presence in the most dangerous neighborhoods, hoping to prevent further acts of retaliation. Community leaders and activists called for peace, urging the gangs to put an end to the cycle of revenge that had caused so much pain and loss. But peace was hard to come by in a city that had been torn apart by years of violence. For the families involved, the road to healing was a long one. Foolio's family continued to mourn their son, knowing that his life had been cut short by the same violence he had been a part of. Rashads and Davin Murphy's family faced the reality that two of their sons were now behind bars, with their futures uncertain. Youngin Ace and his crew continued to live in the shadow of the war, knowing that any day could bring another attack. The future of Jacksonville. As Jacksonville struggled to move forward, the city's future remained uncertain. The cycle of gang violence had taken a toll on the community, leaving scars that would last for years to come. The arrest of key figures like Rashads and Davin Murphy had brought some sense of justice, but it couldn't undo the damage that had been done. The city's leaders knew that in order to prevent future violence, they needed to address the root causes of the problem. Poverty, lack of opportunity, and the influence of gangs had created a dangerous environment for young people in Jacksonville. Without addressing these issues, the cycle of violence was likely to continue, with new generations of young men stepping into the same deadly roles. For now, Jacksonville remained a city on edge, but there was hope that things could change. Community programs aimed at steering young people away from gangs were being developed, and local leaders were working to create more opportunities for education and employment. The road to peace wouldn't be easy, but there were people in Jacksonville who were determined to make it happen. The tragic story of Foolio, his killers, and their families is a stark reminder of the toll that gang violence can take on a community. In Jacksonville, the cycle of revenge left countless families grieving and afraid, as the violence spiraled out of control. The deaths and arrests of key figures like Foolio and the Murphy brothers brought some measure of justice, but they couldn't undo the pain and loss that had been inflicted on the city. The lessons from Jacksonville are clear. Violence only begets more violence, and the cycle of revenge benefits no one. The families caught in the middle of this war paid the ultimate price, losing loved ones and living in constant fear. Breaking the cycle of violence requires more than just arrests. It requires addressing the underlying issues that lead young people to join gangs in the first place. As Jacksonville moves forward, there is hope that the city can heal. But the scars of the past won't be easy to erase, and it will take a concerted effort from everyone in the community to ensure that future generations don't fall into the same deadly trap. The story of Foolio and the gang war in Jacksonville serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences of violence and the importance of finding a path to peace.